So, thank you everyone for coming and welcome to the second session of the Pathos of Modernity. Um, I will read the description of the seminar. So, in the wake of Kant's epochal intervention in the history of philosophy and amid the tumultuous aftermath of the French Revolution, a generation of German philosophers and poets took up the task of rethinking knowledge of the absolute, the problem of freedom, the methodology of dialectical reasoning, the concept of the tragic, and above all, the significance of modernity. The work of Friedrich Hölderlin is central to this pivotal moment in German literature and philosophy in the late 18th and early 19th century. This seminar focuses on Hölderlin's late elegies and hymns, approaching these in light of Hölderlin's poetological writings and his reception by important 20th century thinkers such as Heidegger, Adorno, Nancy, Hammacher, Hendrik. We will play close attention to the formal, conceptual, rhetorical, and tonal particulars of the poems, and we will situate these amid the pathos of modernity, meaning the complex feeling of the movement of history and its wrenching transformations, traverse modern literature and philosophy. And for the second week, we will be focusing on the poem called The Rhine.
Okay, thank you very much, Yuval. And thanks to everyone for coming for the second session. I hope also that we'll finally have some time at the end of this session to do introductions. But at the beginning of the session, I'm now just going to plunge in. And this week, my hope is that we really will be able to dig in even more to one poem. So last week, we focused primarily on bread and wine. As you've all said, this week our focus is going to be on the Rhine. And so again, I'll give an opening lecture, we'll have a Q&A, we'll take a break, and then we'll have open discussion where hopefully we can really range around the poem. So as I go through the lecture, keep in mind questions that you have, but also keep in mind, passages that you want to come back to and talk more about. And then in open discussion, we can just look at, some different passages if you have some in mind. So let me dig into the opening lecture on the Rhine. So this poem was written in 1801, which is an extraordinarily productive year in Hölderlin's career. And this, I think, is a very special poem. In some ways, perhaps the most representative poem of Hölderlin's achievement. And I'll say why I think that might be the case and what I mean by that in a moment when we talk about the form and the structure of this poem. But briefly, I would say last week we looked at a poem, Bread and Wine, written in approximately the same period, which is an extraordinary transposition into German of Greek dactylic hexameter. But it's a formally regular poem. It's written in an established rhythm, an established metrical scheme that Hölderlin inherits from the Greeks and transposes into a modern language. And it's a work of sheer formal and technical mastery in that respect. On the other hand, last week we also looked at a poem, Viven am Feiertage, which again I would prefer to translate as on a day of rest, rather than necessarily as on a holiday. We might be able to come back to that today, actually. But that poem is a nice example of one of Hölderlin's fragmentary masterpieces, a poem that breaks off, that ruptures as it proceeds, and that very rupturing of the poem is crucial to what it is. And we're going to come back to that poem today. But so there we have a poem which is incomplete on the one hand, but has extraordinary poetic power. And on the other hand, we have a poem like Bread and Wine, which is, the perfect specimen of Hölderlin's abilities. It is a complete poem. It's a formal masterpiece, etc. With the Rhine, what's interesting about this poem, first of all, is that it's a key example of uh, Hölderlin's arrival at something that is sort of well and truly his own form. He's writing now in free rhythms, what we would call free verse, indeed. We'll come back to that in a moment. But so that means, I mean, broadly speaking, we have lines of very different lengths in this poem. He can break the line where he wants, and we're going to see that he's working with variations on the strophe form that are quite interesting. So this, I think, is something very important about this poem. Hölderlin arrives at, in this period of his career, the creation of form. Not just a transposition of Greek forms and also not a total breaking of form. This is a poem which is finished, which in many ways is, let's say, like as perfect a poem to some extent as Bread and Wine. Um, but but it has this power of the creation of form itself, and this is something that I think is crucial to also the meaning of this poem. So what I want to talk about in this lecture, I want to go through 6 topics. So first of all, the form and the structure of the poem, which I'll say more about. Secondly, I suppose what we could say the sort of fundamental content of this poem, or what I might call the nature of the poem, which I understand to be, on the one hand, the creation of a myth, and on the other hand, the production of an allegory. So the second thing I want to talk about is this relationship between myth and allegory as a tension in this poem. Third, I want to talk about this poem as an interrogation of destiny or an interrogation of fate, Schicksal, Hölderlin's German. And to some extent, that will be an interrogation of the destiny of modernity. Fourth, I want to talk about this poem as an encounter with the tragic. So one of Hölderlin's key poems, although there are several others, for thinking about the presence of the tragic in his poetry. And in this poem in particular, the relationship between tragedy and utopia. Okay, so that's the fourth thing. The fifth is how this poem is operating as an evocation of pathos. So an evocation of what we have, of feeling, of that which we have to undergo, and of the importance of poetic receptivity. And then finally, sixth, I want to think about this poem as the production of a riddle, ein Rätsel, a riddle or a mystery, but I like the term riddle. Okay, so those are the 6 parts of this lecture. First of all, the form of the poem. Okay, so if you have Hamburger out, right, we're on page begins 196, 197. And I'll put up slides also of the strophes one by one as we work through it in a moment. This poem is written in 15 strophes, right, most of which are 15 lines, almost as though each strophe recapitulates the structure of the poem, or as if the structure of the poem recapitulates the form of each strophe. However, there are variations. So the second strophe is 16 lines, and the third strophe is 14 lines. So that's very interesting, right? He establishes a unit of the strophe, 15 lines in the first one, then he goes one over, then he goes one under. And so we can see that the poem is moving around 15, but that it can vary, and he establishes this right away, very systematically within the first 3 strophes. It's crucial because then you can see that there is, as it were, a sort of structural measure, 15 lines, which the poem adheres to, but it can vary. So this means the poem is free to create its own form to that extent. Variation is possible. within the pattern of the lineation of the strophes. Finally, the 15th strophe, the last strophe, is 12 lines. So we establish measure and variation from measure in that respect. Finally, like I just said, the poem is written in free rhythms or free verse. And here I'm going to go to screen share, and we can take a look at head note that Holderlin writes for his poem Celebration of Peace, which is written in the same year. And so this is a key text for thinking about Holderlin's hymns of the fatherland, he calls them, Vaterlandisch Gesangs. And, you know, editors have sort of shied away from that term because they fear the contamination of the term fatherland by Nazism for good reasons. But at the same time, I think this is a political error, an error of cultural politics to surrender the title that Holderlin gave his poems. Clearly, the title is not meant in a sort of fascist sense. Again, Holderlin's politics are Republican. He certainly is attached to region and to Germanness, but not in the way that Heidegger, I would argue, will appropriate. So I think it's important to hold on to the term hymns of the fatherland and to read it against and in relation to that 20th century history of appropriation and the problem of the politics of nationalism in Germany is a key sort of index for thinking through that problem and Holderlin's relation to it. So I would be in favor of holding on to that designation for Holderlin's last hymns, late hymns. But okay, here we have his head note to Celebration of Peace, where he talks about form, his work in free rhythms. He says, all I ask is that the reader be kindly disposed toward these pages. In that case, he will certainly not find them incomprehensible, far less objectionable. But if, nonetheless, some should think such a language unconventional, I must confess to them, I cannot help it, or more precisely, I cannot do otherwise. Ich kann nichts anders, right? I cannot do otherwise. On a fine day, they should consider almost every mode of song makes itself heard, and nature, whence it originates, also receives it again. The author intends to offer the public an entire collection of such pieces, and this one should be regarded as a kind of sample, eine Probe, Holderlin says. This is Hamburger's translation, but I just want to point out a few things here. So it's the fact that these poems can take their own form, that their form is original to the poems, that Holderlin seems to fear will be thought unconventional. And his defense, his justification, his apology, if you will, is that this is just like nature, right? On a fine day, almost every mode of song makes itself heard and nature receives it again. So again here, a relationship between production, natural production, spontaneous, intentionless, right? I cannot do otherwise. It's not my fault. I can't help it. This is how it has to be. And reception. Nature also receives again the free songs, let's put it that way, which emerge from it. So the idea of poesis that we get here is a sort of formal spontaneity. No, of course, a poem like the Rhine is by no means formally spontaneous. But the claim here is that it's natural in some sense, right? It originates from nature and nature receives it again. So the poem is open to the unfolding of its formal determinations. They are not set according to traditional meters. Okay. Then the structure of the poem. There are different ways of thinking about this. Holderlin has a different structural model for this. Sorry, Heidegger has a different structural model for this poem. But here's how I would describe the structure of this poem, sort of lay out and schematize the structure of this poem, which I understand to operate in 5 parts, with one of them being repeating at the end. The first So the first strophe and the last strophe I would understand as one part of this poem. But let me just run through this quickly, and then we'll come back to various aspects of the poem as we go through. So without flipping through all the strophes, this is how I would describe these strophes. The poem opens with a scene of what I would call poetic visitation or transport. And we might think of this as a relationship between a sort of initiation into the poem in the opening strophe. Then we move to what I'm specifying here as a myth, the creation of a myth. And here we have the poem, which is particularly focused on the Rhine. And it's interesting in this poem that not all of the poem is focused on the Rhine. The Rhine, to some degree, fades away in the second half of this poem. But in the second strophe, we get the sort of inauguration, the creation, the production of a myth. And it's the myth of a demigod, the Rhine. Okay, so again, we'll come back to this, but we get the rage of the demigod. This is how I would describe these strophes very schematically. The roaming of the river, then the riddle of pure source in the fourth strophe, the exaltation of the Rhine, of the river, and then its sort of maturity and its cultivation of German lands in the sixth strophe. Then we begin at the beginning of the seventh strophe to move away from the Rhine. The Rhine recollects its origin. But here we move into a part of the poem which seems to me centered on the problem of the tragic, of tragedy. In strophe 7, the corruption of love. In strophe 8, the relationship between gods and mortals. In strophe 9, the arrival at a well-apportioned fate. And then, crucially in this poem, beginning at strophe 10, the figure of Rousseau appears in the poem. And this is a crucial transition. And here, I would say it becomes important to read kind of retroactively also into the beginning of the poem and the movement of the poem, an allegory. That is to say, a relationship between the history of modernity and the problem of freedom in modernity and the myth of the demigod of the Rhine. And now Rousseau is described also as a demigod. And so we get a sort of an allegory of modernity. The Rhine now and the figure of Rousseau become mapped onto a kind of thinking of the problem and the question of modernity in strophe 10 and strophe 11. Then we get a part of the poem which seems to be a kind of evocation of utopia, I would say. This strophe on the shaper of the earth, der Bildner, the former, if you want, the creator. I like the shaper. Then this beautiful strophe on the bridal feast, utopian, paradisal strophe. And then a strophe on pertaining to measure, the question of measure, for each has his own measure. That would be the fifth section of this poem that I discern. And then I would argue with the 15th strophe, we return to its relationship to the first in the woods. And here we get the figure of Sinclair, Isaac von Sinclair, to whom this poem is dedicated. And here we get an evocation, perhaps, we'll return to this question, this interpretive problem of conspiracy or clandestinity, but also just of friendship. But we'll return to the possible political symbolism of this strophe in a while and how it bears upon this creation of an allegory, a political allegory in the poem. Okay, so that's the overall, that's what I want to work through. And now I will begin to do that. So we've already talked about the form and structure. Then what about the content of this poem, right? So here we're moving into the poem. itself. And I've and so here I want to think about, I want to return to this question of the relationship between myth and allegory. So how does this poem operate as the creation of a myth? So here we see in the second strophe um, the scene of the demigod raging, das Rasen des Halbgotts, the end of the strophe, the demigod's raving or raging. Um, the poem moves in the first strophe from the speaker sitting at the forest gate, right? We'll come back to this strophe in a minute, but and looking at the Alpine ranges, at the Alps, which he calls the fortress of the heavenly. And here in the second poem, it's an extraordinary sort of moment of poetic sort of omniscience, right? The poet can see within the mountains now, right? So before, poetic perspective is from at a distance, the woods looking up at the Alps, but now deep down below the silvery summits and in the midst of gay verdure, there shuddering the forests and the heads of rocks overlapping, looked down at him all day. There in the coldest chasm, I heard the youth implore release. And full of pity, his parents heard him rage there and accuse his mother earth and the thunderer who fathered him. But mortals fled from the place, for dreadful, as without light he writhed within his fetters, was the demigod's raving. So here we get the topos of the demigod in coldest abyss, kaltesten Abgrund, and the youth of the Rhine figured as a demigod. So it's a modern creation of a mythic figure, a demigod specific to Holderlin's region and also to the relationship, particularly here between Switzerland and Germany, which will become important when we encounter as well the figure of Rousseau and the political allegory of this poem. And as we move through the opening strophes of the poem from 2 to 6, we see the Rhine roaming first toward Asia, because indeed the Rhine first, its source is in the Alps in Graubünden, and it first flows east and then flows uh, northwest. And of course, the Rhine will then flow through Swabia, through the Black Forest, and out into the sea at Cologne. So it passes through and alongside France and up through um, Western Germany. Um, the Rhine is happily born. We'll come back to this strophe in a moment, meditating upon the pure origin. So it's a pun, right? Rheinen and Sprüngenes. So Rhein means pure, and it means the river Rhine. Um, we see the jubilant roar of the youthful god, right? His adventures, right? He's a demigod like Hercules, tearing through, breaking boundaries. The forests join his flight, the mountains collapse, etc. Um, and now we get the maturity of the demigod, who attains what I would call, to use a Greek term, sophrosune, or temperance, the key virtue in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Um, and he matures and cultivates German lands. He becomes Father Rhine, right? So no more the arrogant, adventurous youth, but the calm, temperate father figure who supports dear children in cities which he has founded. So this is the myth of the Rhine that the poem opens with from strophes 2 to 6. But then I would argue that the poem also involves, okay, the creation of an allegory. And we can already see elements of this um, in the second strophe, the political allegory of this poem. It was the voice of the noblest rivers, the noblest of rivers, of freeborn Rhine, freigeborene Rhines. So the freeborn Rhine. And here, commentators have argued that the river is freeborn insofar as it's born, it has its source in Switzerland. So we're going to see the justification for this, or part of the motivation for it, when we get to the figure of Rousseau. But the French invade Switzerland in 1798, and they establish the Helvetica Republic. So Switzerland is a republican. Well, it's a republic when Hölderlin is writing this poem. And again, as I mentioned last time, Hölderlin and his friend Isaac Sinclair have aspirations for the creation of a Swabian republic, and they identify with the ideals of the republican ideals of the French Revolution. Switzerland here then is a sort of example of the spreading of the revolution to other lands. And here that modern event, the creation of the Helvetica Republic in Switzerland, is arguably identified with the source of the Rhine, the freeborn Rhine. So there we begin something like the constitution of a kind of allegory of political modernity, which is mapped on to the myth of the Rhine as a demigod. And it is an allegory which raises the problem of freedom. What is it to be freeborn? And as we'll see then in strophe 4, the poet will ask, but where is anyone so happily born as the Rhine, from such propitious heights, and from so holy a womb, to remain free, frei zu bleiben, his whole life long, and alone fulfill his heart's desire like him. So the Rhine is the icon of one who was born free and can remain free his whole life long. Okay, by the time we get to strophe 10, the speaker now recurs to the figure of the demigod, of demigods now, I think, Halbgötter. And he comes to think of Rousseau. Of demigods now, I think, and I must know these dear ones, because so often their lives move me and fill me with longing. But he whose soul, like yours, Rousseau, ever strong and patient, became invincible, endowed with steadfast purpose, and a sweet gift of hearing, of speaking, so that from holy profusion, like the wine god, foolishly, divinely, and lawlessly, he gives it away, the language of the purest, Heinesten, comprehensible to the good, but rightly strikes with blindness the irreverent, the profaning rabble. What shall I call that stranger? Den Fremden. So here Rousseau enters the poem, and it was one of the secondary poems assigned for this week. Hölderlin also wrote an ode to Rousseau, in which Rousseau is represented as the harbinger of the French Revolution, as a kind of prophetic figure. Here represented as a demigod, ever strong and patient, who becomes invincible. And importantly, the speech of Rousseau, right? It has a sweet gift of hearing and of speaking. And here it's a kind of poetic gift, right? It's a free emergence of language, like that of Dionysus, like the wine god, which foolishly, divinely, and lawlessly is given forth. The language of the purest. So here we can see also an evocation of something like, perhaps, a free rhythm of speech, of hearing and of speaking, which is a kind of poetic profusion, a pure poesis, right? The language of the purest, with which Rousseau is here identified. And then in the next strophe, we find again Lake Bina, the Bielersee in Switzerland, where Rousseau stayed on an island during a period of exile. So Rousseau is exiled from France, and then he'll be exiled from Bern in Switzerland, and he'll go live on this island um, on Lake Bina. So there's a kind of triangulation here, right? Here, we're in the woods again, where the beam does not sear, im Schatten des Walds. We move back to that opening evocation of the woods in the first strophe. So Rousseau, I would say, is identified with the Rhine um, through the term um, der Rheinisten, right? The language of the purist. He's also identified with the poet, both through this gift of free speech and by his situation in the foliage, in the woods, in shadow. If we go back to the first strophe, we see that he's in dark ivy at the beginning of the poem, and then he is im warmen Schatten, right? So he's in warm shade. He's looking out from the woods towards the Alps, and Rousseau would be doing the same. Hölderlin would be in Hauptwil, where he wrote this poem. He's working as a tutor in Switzerland, just south of the Bodensee, so basically close to Swabia, close to the southeastern edge of the Black Forest. Rousseau would be south of Bern, and then the source of the Rhine is here. So there's a kind of triangulation of the poetic speaker of Rousseau and of the source of the Rhine. And each are identified in this 11th strophe. It returns us to the beginning of the poem. Rousseau is the one with the gift of free speech, and also the one who sings sort of careless, poor in tones, but careless, blithely here, like beginners who learns from nightingales. So a beautiful evocation again of these songs in nature that Hölderlin speaks of in his head note to celebration of peace. So the free rhythms of natural song can be, as it were, learned from nightingales, but also Rousseau speaks the language of the purist. So he is also freeborn, right? And he is Swiss, and he is living in Switzerland in this period of exile. If we go back, we also, in terms of this political allegory, in strophe 7, right? So Rousseau as the prophet of the French Revolution, who then goes into exile and is identified with both the speaker and the Rhine. In strophe 7, the Rhine recalls his origin. And then at the end of this strophe, right, the question is, who was the first to coarsen, to corrupt the bonds of love and turn them into ropes? I would prefer to translate that as, who was it who first corrupted the bands of love and made them into bindings? So this question of the corruption, the origin of the corruption of love, and then something which seems to bear upon the modern situation of revolutionary excess, perhaps, then sure of their own rights and of the heavenly fire, defiant rebels mocked, not till then despising mortal ways, chose foolhardy arrogance and strove to become the equals of gods. So again, commentators have read in here a sort of evocation of the Jacobin terror or the cult of the supreme being, the elevation of Robespierre to a kind of demigod, and the excess, in the terms of Greek tragedy, we could say the ate of Jacobin politics. So again, these are open questions. These are disputable interpretations, but that element of a revolutionary political allegory bearing specifically upon modern politics. Similarly, at the end of the next strophe, right, the rule of the gods is that he shall demolish his own house and curse like an enemy those dearest to him, and under the rubble shall bury his father and child. When one aspires to be like them, like the gods, refusing to bear with inequality, der Schwärmer. We talked about this last time. I would translate that as the zealot. So again, the one who goes too far, and here will not bear inequality. So now the political allegory becomes complicated. The Rhine is free-born. There's a valorization of free speech in the poem, the language of the purist, um, but also a sort of cautioning not to go too far, that one has to accept inequality, not necessarily between human beings, but between human beings and the gods. Um, okay, so what I want to hold in mind here, and I think this is absolutely crucial to this poem, in my opinion, perhaps the central thing about this poem, is this tension between myth and allegory. Why is it a tension? Because I would say myth is a kind of immanent production of meaning. A myth does not mean something other than itself. It is a story. It is its own meaning, as it were. It means itself. Its meaning is immanent to the production of the myth. Um, Whereas an allegory, we might identify with a certain form of transcendence. That is to say, there's a splitting between levels of meaning, which is absolutely crucial, constitutive of allegory. One thing means something else. There are two levels of the determination of meaning, a sort of, well, we could say manifest and implicit content. Um, and allegory differs from myth in that respect. In one of them, the sense of its meaning is immanent to the story. In the other one, the story which is told means something else, right? There's two levels of meaning. And here, there's a division between myth and allegory, but also an identity of myth and allegory. So there's a tension, there's a problem of the relationship between the production of a myth and the production of an allegory, which is internal to this poem. And it has to do partly with the relationship of myth to modernity. What does it mean to create a new demigod in the situation of modernity? And then, in some ways, to have that figure represent at another level of meaning the problem of freedom or the problem of revolutionary history. One way of thinking about that tension would be to say it's something like a tension between the naive and the sentimental in Schiller's terms, where myth would be naive and allegory would be sentimental, to be divided from and to want to go back to, but also to be split, to be riven, to undergo separation. And in this sense, we can think of Hölderlin as a poet who is at one and the same time naive and sentimental. And we can map that onto this problem of the relationship between myth and allegory. Okay. Third, um, I want to say that this poem, and here we can move a little more quickly and see how this fits into this problem of the relation between myth and allegory. The poem is an interrogation of a destiny or of fate. Um, we can see this already in the opening strophe, or this is evoked quite explicitly. The speaker, without warning, senses, hears a destiny or a fate. So the German is vernahm ich ohne Vermuten ein Schicksal. Right? So the key term here is vernahm. The noun meaning something like it's ambiguous. Hamburger translates it as hear. I think it has a broader extension than that in this context. I would translate it as I sensed a destiny, but it means something like to intimate. Um, uh, to feel, um, but it evokes a sort of sensory experience, which is also an intimation, a sense of. I'm just looking at my notes here. Um, and so here, this will be, as we'll see in a moment, crucial for thinking about the pathos of modernity. there's something like the sense of a destiny, the feeling of a destiny, the intimation, to sense, to hear, to perceive, or to intimate. And so this is what spurs the poem. Without warning, something happens to the speaker. There's an event. Um, he senses a destiny. And so the poem will pursue this destiny or fate. We'll see this term Schicksal appear again in the third strophe, where the poet will say, it shows incomprehension, a lack of understanding, to wish in the face of fate or to wish before fate. Impudent it is, yet in the face of fate, imprudent it is to wish, but it's unverstandig, right? So uncomprehending, right? It shows a lack of understanding. So if there is a fate, right, you don't get to have your wish. It shows a lack of understanding, or it's uncomprehending to wish in the face of fate or of destiny. And then again, strophe 9. So here, there's an evocation of happiness or contentment for the one who finds a well-allotted fate, let's say a well-apportioned fate, wohlbescheidenes Schicksal. So again, the term Schicksal. So we're tracing this term. So it's uncomprehending to wish in the face of fate, but happy is he who has found a well-allotted or a well-apportioned fate. So again, the sort of evocation of something like sophrosune, of temperance, of finding what is measured, what is well apportioned, not going beyond, not going too far. And then again in strophe 13, extraordinary, an important passage in Holderlin. Then the gods and mortals celebrate their nuptials. Well, Brautfest, the bridal festival, right? All the living celebrate. And fate for a while is leveled out, suspended. Und ausgeglichen ist eine Weile das Schicksal. So leveled out or balanced. So during the celebration, during the festival, during the bridal festival, which is celebrated by both gods and mortals, here we have a balancing out of fate, as if accounts are being balanced, as if the scales are being leveled out. So this is the tracing of the problem of destiny or fate throughout the poem. And we might think of how the river then constitutes a kind of figure of that tracing of destiny, right? That is to say, we move from origin, from source, from what springs from the pure source, to the end, to the terminus, to the flowing out of the river. As we follow the path of the river from origin to end, as a sort of figure of what we have to undergo, but also a myth of undergoing. We also follow perhaps the figure of, or the allegory of modernity. What is the fate of modernity? What is the destiny of revolution? What is the destiny of freedom, right? To move from what is freeborn to the crisis of it's going too far, right? To undergo that problem of freedom. We can see then that this tracing of Schicksal, of fate or of destiny, is related to the problem of the tragic in the Rhine. Okay, so again, it's in strophe 7 where we come across these rebels who make a mockery of their own rights. It's a very interesting claim. It would be difficult not to read this in relationship to to the drama and the crisis of the French Revolution as it moves through the terror. Again, Holderlin is a partisan of the revolution, but later it's a little bit apocryphal. But as he's being arrested, as he's being taken to um, this asylum in Tübingen, he'll say, "I'm not a Jacobin," or "I don't want to be a Jacobin." And he'll supposedly protest that he is not a Jacobin. Um, so there's a question in the political interpretation of Holderlin. Are his Republican politics more Girondin or Jacobin? How radical is he? We'll see how important this is to the end of this poem. And the key book, the most famous book on this question, is Pierre Berthot's Holderlin and the French Revolution, where Berthaud argues for Holderlin's Jacobin politics. That's controversial. Many people think that he is wrong. But it's an interesting study of Holderlin's politics vis-a-vis the French Revolution. But here, okay, in this, as I argued, in this strophe, we get something like an evocation of going too far. Verwegenes, verwegenes erwalt. So to go too far, to choose here in this, choose foolhardy arrogance. Um, so the Greek term is ate, recklessness, to go too far. There's a crucial element of Greek tragedy. So, for example, uh, Antigone would be a figure of ate, right? She'll be punished because she goes too far. Of course, she's a heroic figure, but the heroism is bound up with excess. In the next strophe, we get an evocation of hubris, right? Of refusing to bear the inequality between gods and mortals, of aspiring to be like the gods. This is what Holderlin will dramatize in his play, The Death of Empedocles. Empedocles thinks that he has become a god. So, strophe 7, ate, strophe 8, hubris, and then an evocation of something like sophrosune or temperance, a well-allotted fate. Which is also evoked earlier, right? The god, not the demigod, wants to spare his sons. This a life so fleeting, and he tries to restrain them, right? To bring them into to help them to be more temperate. And this is the maturation of the Rhine, of the demigod. So the poem moves through a meditation on tragedy or the tragic. And maybe in the Q&A or in discussion, we can look back on how this also relates to um, Viven am Feiertage, as on a day of rest, where we also have a very important evocation of the relationship between the tragic and poesis as the absolute. The key thing for understanding Holderlin's relation to tragedy, I think, which is very complex, is that his concept of the tragic, which I don't have on a slide, but which he spells out in a note on tragedy, on the meaning of tragedies, in the volume that we have of essays and letters in English, where he says the argument is basically it's basically an argument about the ontological difference. The argument is that normally what is originary is equally distributed, right? It's parceled out amid all the beings, and therefore it can only appear in its weakness. It can't appear as one or as originary because it's divided out. It's shared out among all the beings. So the paradox of tragedy is that if the originary normally appears in its weakness, it can only appear in its strength, Holderlin says, if it equals zero. If the sign, he says, equals zero. So that is to say, if there's an annihilation of a representative being. So let's say the way of the world, the normal state of affairs is that the originary is divided, separated, shared out. But one determinate being that becomes representative um, precisely by way of going too far, will be annihilated, will become zero. And this will be the sort of showing, the exposure of the absolute. The absolute cannot present itself. The originary cannot present itself. It cannot be seen. It cannot be manifest except through the annihilation of a being. This is Holderlin's concept of the tragic. Um, the problem is, how is it possible to bring the absolute into manifestation through poesis? We'll see that this is also a question at the end of this poem and in Vivant an Feiertage. Okay, also in this poem, we get these beautiful evocations of utopia. Right here, we return in strophe 12 to the beginning of the poem, waking after sleeping in the coolness of the woods, right? So the poetic speaker and also Rousseau are in the shadows of the woods. Now they wake. The speaker wakes at evening to walk now toward the softer light when he who built the mountains and drafted the paths of the rivers, having also smilingly directed the busy lives of men so short of breath like sails and filled them with his breezes, reposes also. And down to his pupil, the master craftsman, der Bildner, finding more good than evil, day now inclines to the present earth, and we arrive at the celebration of the bridal feast, the marriage of gods and mortals. So a relationship between tragedy and utopia. Okay. Fifth, an evocation of pathos, which I've already begun to describe. That is to say, of poetic receptivity. So the pathos of modernity refers to the feeling of modernity, the suffering of the undergoing of modernity as it moves through its wrenching contradictions. This poem begins with a visitation, den Quell besuchend. So besuchend, to visit. Uh, the poem is a kind of visitation. The poet is sitting amid dark ivy, just as golden noon visits the source. This is the inauguration of the poem. So there's a visitation of the sun to the source, and we can see here a kind of exposure to exteriority. The poem as a visitation, as what comes down and intersects with, like a ray of light. And then the poem is the sensing, the intimation, the perceiving of a destiny. This also is a figure of what I would call pathos, of openness to exteriority, to what is sensed, taken in, receptivity. In strophe 4, this extraordinary evocation of the moment of birth. I'll read the strophe. I would prefer to translate the first line as, it's difficult to translate in English because of this glorious German compound word here, rein and sprungenes. I would translate that formulation as, what springs from pure source is a riddle. What springs from pure source is a riddle, or a riddle is that which springs from true source, or from pure source. So I'll read Hamburger's. A mystery are those of pure origin. Even song may hardly unveil it. For as you began, so you will remain. As much as need can affect and breeding or nurture, still greater power adheres to your birth and the ray of light that meets the newborn infant. But where is anyone so happily born as the Rhine from such propitious heights, etc.? So it's the first ray of light that you encounter when you are born that makes you what you are. For as you began, so you will remain. So this also, I would say, is a figure of pathos. inaugural pathos. Um, it's the first ray of light that meets the newborn infant, which does the most to make them what they are. Inaugural receptivity. Finally, a famous passage, an important passage for thinking about Holderlin's poetics in general, on the relation between gods and mortals. So here, um, the mortals feel on behalf of the gods. So to read it in Hamburger's translation, but their own immortality suffices the gods. More simply, maybe even just like is enough for the gods. And if the heavenly have need of one thing, it is of heroes and human beings and other mortals. For since the most blessed in themselves feel nothing, another, if to say such a thing is permitted, must, I suppose, vicariously feel in the name of the gods. Teilnehmend fühlen ein anderer. So another must feel on behalf of the gods. Here, vicariously feel in the name of the gods. Structure of the exception. The gods don't need anything. They have enough. Their own immortality is enough for them. But here it's und, right? And if they need one thing, so the conditional exception, if there is an exception, it is heroes and men and other mortals. Right? Because they feel nothing in themselves, they suffice to themselves, are immanent to themselves, they are not receptive to exteriority. So the claim, they're fully within themselves, in the immanence of their immortality, sufficient unto themselves, they feel nothing. They need another to feel on their behalf. And that's what mortals do. As we'll see in many of Holderlin's poems, it's the elements which are the mediation. The humans feel the elements, and this is the feeling on behalf of the gods, and the gods are in the elements, right? And they're also in song. So this also is a figure of pathos, feeling on behalf of the gods. The gods use us, den brauchen sie, right? They use us for this, to feel in their name on their behalf. Finally, the idea of the poem as a riddle, right? It's a pun. What springs from the pure source, from the source of the Rhine, is a riddle, ein Rätsel. How does the poem work as a riddle? Well, I would say partly it works as a riddle through this tense relation between myth and allegory. The problem is partly, what is the political allegory of this poem? Can it be, is it a self-identical allegory? Is it a completely coherent allegory? What's its meaning? What's its sense? That is to say, what's its determination of the destiny of modernity, or at least the problem of the destiny of modernity? Does it have an equivocal meaning, this allegory? Or does it have a univocal meaning? Can the riddle be answered? So here I think the final strophe is of the highest importance for thinking about the political allegory of this poem. And the meaning of the intervention of the figure of Isaac von Sinclair, to whom the poem is dedicated, Holderlin's friend, who was in radical sympathy with the French Revolution and who aspired toward the creation of a Swabian republic, that is, a revolution within Swabia that would establish a republic on the border with France. And that a figure who has known Holderlin since 1794. Indeed, it's possible that they met at Fichte's lectures in Jena. They met in Jena. Sinclair will be arrested for treason in 1804. And then Holderlin will be implicated in this. And basically, what happens is there's a dispute between Sinclair um, and another political figure who basically says that Sinclair has been planning uh, with his friends, including Holderlin, eventually will be implicated to murder the elector of Württemberg. So that the elector of Württemberg is a would be the ruler who might here be referred to in the final strophe of this poem if we read it in this politically allegorical manner. So Sinclair is arrested for treason. He's later released. Holderlin is implicated. He's judged mad and cannot stand trial. And supposedly they're having conversations, plotting with their friends the assassination of the elector of Württemberg. Um, so when Pierre Bertel comes to read this final strophe of the Rhine, he argues that the evocation of Sinclair here is a kind of incitement to tyrannicide. Um, and it's a very interesting reading of the poem, a controversial reading of the poem, a reading of the poem that I don't think can be verified. But let's look at the final strophe. Um, To you, in the heat of a path under fir trees or within the oak forest half light, wrapped in steel, my Sinclair. I would translate that as girt in steel, gehüllt im Stahl, gehüllt in Stahl, mein Sinclair. God may appear, Gott erscheinen, may be manifest. Or in clouds you'll know him, since youthfully you know the good God's power. And never from you the smile of the ruler is hidden by day, when all that lives seems febrile and fettered, or also by night, when all is mingled chaotically and back again comes primeval confusion. Berthaud's reading of this strophe, and I do think there's something here, right, is that this evocation of steel. Sinclair is represented as a kind of hero, but here he's girt in steel. Um, and that there's an evocation here of the possibility of tyrannicide because he has access to the ruler, right? The smile of the ruler is never hidden from you by day, right? Or also by night. When all is mingled, then this evocation of the return of chaos. Alles gemischt ist ordnungslos, right? Orderless. Und wiederkehrt alte Verwirrung. I would translate that as, or also by night, when all is intermingled, or when everything intermingled is orderless, or when all intermingled is orderless, and ancient confusion returns. So here, at the end of the poem, an evocation of ancient confusion returning, a returning to the source. We know that in Hesiod, right, creation stems from chaos. And here, chaos, orderlessness returns. It seems to me that there's an exposure to danger at the end of this poem, which has to do with its earlier evocation of the tragic. The night is the time of tragedy, of the Dionysian, when everything that seems weak and fettered during the day now is mingled together and chaotic, orderless. And back again comes primeval confusion. We can see how perhaps the problem of freedom in the poem is here related to the return of chaos, and that the political is at stake in this relationship. That the politics of freedom always verges upon going too far, of tipping over into hubris, identification with the gods, or orderlessness, chaos and confusion. And that here, in some way or another, this is linked with the evocation of Holderlin's friend Sinclair, the political radical, who is girt in steel and has access to the ruler at all times during both day and night. I want to end this lecture by saying something then about interpreting this kind of passage, this kind of riddle. It is a riddle, I think. The poem, to some extent, seems to be something like a magic word, or uh, why am I blanking? The term, for example, in Ceylon, a shibboleth, a password. There's an evocation of a certain complicity or clandestinity or possibly conspiracy, which is precisely what Sinclair will eventually be after this poem is written, but later be accused of. Here, I think we just get an evocation of something like the mood of that. We don't have to decide one way or another um, whether there is a sort of incitement to tyrannicide at the end of this poem. Berteau makes that argument. It's a very strong argument. Others question it for good reasons. Um, it's a controversial, contestable argument. But I think what's important here is an evocation of the feeling of political danger and clandestinity. Under the fir trees, in the oak forest half-light, wrapped in steel, the return of primeval or primordial confusion. And this being put in relationship to the production of a myth of the freeborn Rhine and its allegorization as the problem of the destiny of modernity, here returning to a state of chaos, which is the pure source. If we feel that in the poem, I think my argument would be to think in terms of the pathos of modernity. It's the feeling of the riddle that we want. It's the elucidation of the riddle, not its solution. This is what poetry consists in. Poetry doesn't have to be philosophical or political doctrine. Poetry doesn't have to be a political manifesto. It's the evocation of a mood in this poem and of a tension between myth and allegory, which is to some extent then the relationship, let's say, between history and the earth, between geography and time. And the feeling at the end of this poem of the eternal return as the freedom of orderlessness and the exposure to the precipitation of political danger that involves. Okay, I'll take off screen share and we can go to Q&A. Yes, Matvey.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to probably just ask a question about the what it for stanza number 14. So it's the one before the one we just talked about, and just like structurally looking at this development, after marriage we kind of seem to have some form of reconciliation being discussed in a poem. But then, interestingly enough, and I would love to hear what how you interpret it, or maybe how Heidegger looks at it. Is the fourth line of the 14th stanza where um, Elderlin talks about the eternal gods are full of life at all times, but until death, immortal too, can retain and bear in mind what is best, and then is supremely favored. So it full of life. I don't speak German. I was wondering if that has anything, this fullness has anything to do with this access earlier discussed, and in some way whether it can be related to this annihilation that you were also relating to that surplus, and because I am thinking about Hegel while evoking it, and particularly his response to the terror of Robespierre. But at the same time, it seems like it already in its commentary is past that, and it's kind of talking about this more kind of new formation between like of a bond between the human and gods, and this kind of catastrophic, almost eschatological tension that I don't know if you see there, or if I'm reading into the German that I don't.
No, I mean the German here is pretty simple. The ewigen Götter sind voll Lebens allzeit, right? So yeah, the eternal gods are full of life. Allzeit, that's an interesting, right? At all times is a little bit light. um forever, or the sort of wholeness of time is evoked there, I would say. Um so yes, I think that's related to that earlier passage where um, the immortality of the gods is enough for them. Right? They don't, but if they need anything, it is mortals to feel on their behalf. Um, so they are replete with life always. You know, that's what their immortality and eternity is. So it's not a dead immortality or eternity, right? This is the import of polytheism. It's a living. The gods are living, they're ever living. Um, but until death, again, the German here is pretty clear. A mortal can, right, bear in mind, hold in mind um, uh, what is best, and then is supremely favored. Um, Yet each of us has his measure. So I think the problem of the tragic earlier of ate and of hubris, of going too far, of going beyond one's proper measure, of identifying oneself with the gods and refusing to bear inequality with them. Here, it's possible, the strophe says, to sustain one's favor by bearing in mind what is best, um, and to remain within one's proper measure, which each of us has. So I think in order to understand a strophe like this, yes, one has to have in mind the problem of the tragic, which is crucial to this poem. And if you read The Death of Empedocles, you'll see there the dramatization, right, of the figure of the philosopher prophet Empedocles, who can perform sort of miracles, is almost identical with nature, and who takes himself to be a god and is then cast out of the polis. Um, so, but I think the larger question here is how a passage like this is related to the destiny of modernity, to the sort of, you know, the problem of the relation between the teleology or the contingency of revolution, which brings to bear, um, in bringing to bear, let's say, the problem of freedom, opens up the possibility of hubris and of going too far. And the question is, let's say how to find the measure without being just like a moderate. Um, how to reconcile revolution with measure, I would say, is what's at issue here. Okay, there's a bunch of other hands. I think Peggy, you were next, and then Bagum, and then Nikos. Hello?
This operates as an allegory, but not like something like Pilgrim's Progress would. It operates on many levels. So you really just can do what you want with the allegory. You can have the Greek gods, you can have famous people, you can have Christianity in this. The boy at the bottom of the river could be the author himself. It could be Sinclair. It could be somebody who's a spirit in the river. It just seems very ripe for interpretation. So I don't know how you can actually go too wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
I even feel Dante in this in the beginning when I read it. When, he's like
sure.
looking at the water and the
Yeah.
heights. He's outside of it, and then he sort of goes into it as a vision. I sort of feel Dante in this. I sort of feel Revelations in this. It seems to
Sure.
me that it's just got a lot of allegory going on, but not defined to anything. It's a mapping, sort of. And
Yeah,
that's all I can say.
I think the problem that in saying that the poem, you know, makes us reckon with the relationship between myth and allegory, I am, I suppose, saying something a little stronger than that. I'm not saying we can necessarily determine a sort of one-to-one allegory like Pilgrim's Progress. I think you're right that the allegory is more complicated than that. So that is to say, we have the problem of the significance of the allegory and the question of if a sort of allegorical relation between two levels can be established. But I do think what I'm arguing is that that problem does confront us. And so the way that I try to read is I think that it's very important, as you're emphasizing, to sustain a level of poetic ambiguity about the meaning of signs and the multiplicity of reference that we might include within the sense of an allegorical framework, or let's say symbolic framework that might be operating in this poem. But when I use the word allegory, I go a little bit beyond that, right? So I am saying there is something like a continuous order of meaning, which is evoked at a political level, bearing on the relationship between political modernity and this mythos of the Rhine. And I'm saying that it's established by the problem of freedom, so that we can see in the figure of the Rhine, born in Switzerland, the free-born Rhine, we can map that allegorically onto the problem of the destiny of the French Revolution and the spreading of that revolution through the Napoleonic Wars. Now, we want to be careful and flexible about that, but I think we're confronted with that sort of possibility. As we try to think through that possibility, we want to think, okay, that does correlate with these passages about Rousseau as a prophet of revolution, which we can read in relation to Hölderlin's Ode on Rousseau. It also correlates with this evocation of the rebels who go too far and don't respect the inequality of gods and mortals. We might think about that in relationship to the history of the Jacobins, and then put that in relation to Rousseau as a prophet of revolutionary history, whose legacy might be either compromised or realized through that sequence, depending on one's politics. We might also link it to this evocation of the political radical Sinclair at the end of the poem and the possibility of a kind of subversive reading of that strophe and an evocation of conspiracy and clandestinity, politically speaking. So I want to argue, and this is my sort of way of thinking about what I call poetic determination. What we want to establish, I think, when reading a poem are determinate fields of indeterminacy. We don't want to say that everything is determinate in the poem, but we also, in my opinion, don't want to say we give up the task of interpretation if we just say it can be whatever, right? We wanted to establish certain determinate regions within which indeterminacies of interpretation, that is to say, interpretive problems and ambiguities, confront us. And then we can think through the problematic, the problems of interpretation that we encounter in doing so. So for me, I'm pressing the point with the claim about allegory because I do think there's a through line in this poem, without which certain things don't make sense. What's the relationship between the freeborn Rhine and these rebels who mock their own rights, right? So the relation between freedom, rights, and equality. So that, for me, allegorizes something like the problem of the French Revolution, and we can relate it to the myth of the demigod. But of course, that's not to say other readings of the poem are not possible, that other key frameworks of reference and allusion and interpretation are not operative. But I think, the problem of allegory forces us to question the limits of that. But Begum, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. And I think my question will kind of follow what Peggy, I think, opened up because I kind of also like them saw in the poem. I mean, I couldn't actually quite. I ask myself who is the tragic character here, because usually in tragedy we have a set course of events, and here we see a quite uneventful journey actually. Like the events sometimes intervene, but like at the most of the time, we see this this internalized turmoil of various characters, and the characters here are all only invoked. They are not really set on course. They are not doing anything. And the transformation from Rousseau to Sinclair to other allegories, they are also left to us. And I think that ambiguity you mentioned kind of points to something. I think French Revolution or the political setting is there, but I think Hölderlin is more metaphysical than that, and I think he kind of wants to establish this ambiguity so that the what is tragic is here not a person, not a hero anymore, because we are not in the age of
Yep.
heroes, because the gods have left us. So what is tragic is a setting actually. So the setting, the background is the modernity or whatever that is. At that time, it can be like the French Revolution, but at the other times, it will be something else because gods have left us, and who knows if they will return or not. So the tragic setting is kind of wanted to be made more more durable. Like I felt kind of close to the poem. I felt like I kind of connected it. And when it's a political poem, I don't connect with it. Like something puts me off. But here something kind of invited me, and I was like questioning what is it? And I was like a kind of able to see myself there, like kind of was able to associate with different places. I don't know. So I think that ambiguity uh, is kind of something that is important. Um, and maybe the tragic character is now a people, like the people, and that might change throughout history. But I felt like he kind of opens these ways of being. Like Rousseau is something that is turning into demigod, but before that, Rhine was turning into demigod, and they were like evolving in these different ways, but in a similar way. Like there's a function that we can create, and I quite liked how you like gave this like 6 points, and I felt like that kind of really made me see the poem in a different way, but I don't quite convince myself that it is about some specific event. Rather, it's more functionalized. When the poem is like seen more functionalized, it makes more sense to me. I don't know.
Yep. So I think, I mean, again, when I present a lecture like this, it's not that I don't want to insist that my reading of the poem is the only correct reading of the poem. The idea rather is to present our reading of the poem, which then can spur disagreement, can fold off in different ways, can make people see or allow people to see how their relation of the poem might vary from what I'm saying. But I think one thing I would say, I agree, this is a metaphysical poem. We see that at the end of the poem. You might say the poem is a poem about what Nietzsche will call the eternal return, right? That is the return of the origin, which comes back again and is chaos, is orderlessness, is primeval confusion. That this is poiesis, the eternal welling up of creation from chaos, and the question, the problem of its relationship to law. Now, I think that metaphysical problem, it is a metaphysical problem. It's a question that bears upon the laws of nature. It's a question that here is turned into a myth through the figure of the Rhine, right? The river is that which stems from the pure source, which breaks through the boundaries that try to hold it, right? It tears through anything that tries to bind it. And it therefore allegorizes, or it therefore is a myth of the sort of natural fecundity, it's of creation. When I read it in a political way, I would hesitate to distinguish too strongly between metaphysics and politics and Hölderlin. That is to say, I wouldn't oppose those two ways of thinking about the poem. It is a metaphysical poem about the relationship, let's say, between chaos and law. But it's also a political poem in the sense that tragedy is both metaphysical and political, right? It bears upon the question of ananke, of necessity or of destiny or of fate, and how that intersects with the problem of freedom. Now, here, I think that the problem of freedom and its relationship to destiny is crucially bound up with the question of revolution in modernity. And that revolution we see, or at least I think it's implicit in a part of the poem like this, where we go from the Rhine recalling its origin, I'll never forget the pure voice of his youth. Holderlin will write another poem called The Voice of the People, Stimme der Volkes. And here, then sure of their own rights and of the heavenly fire, defiant rebels mocked, not till then despising mortal ways. Okay, so this could be Prometheus. This is a Promethean orientation, right? The heavenly fire. But here, which makes a mockery of their own rights, eigenen Rechts. So it's this language of right and of rebellion that that makes me and others see a dimension of this poem relating the metaphysical problem of fate, the relation between chaos, origin, and law, to the question of revolution. So one way to think about that would be to say something like, in modernity, the metaphysical problem of the tragic, of the presentation of the absolute through the contradiction of the relation between necessity and freedom, is the problem of revolution. And that the tragic problem of ate and of hubris is recapitulated by the problem of the French Revolution in modernity. And that therefore the metaphysical problems that attend the concept of the tragic and the feeling of the tragic bear themselves out in modernity through what it is to undergo the French Revolution, the experience of the contradictions of the French Revolution. So they're real contradictions, but this is also why I say that the poem involves, what I don't want to do is just read this poem as an allegory. I want to say that the poem is a sort of contradiction between myth and allegory. That in fact it can't be reconciled with one or the other, but is the problem of their relationship. So the problem of the myth of the demigod to the history of modernity.
Yeah, just a quick addition. Yeah, I think what you said made sense now, because like he talks about like this poetic sentiment and like this receptivity, and what you receive at that moment from nature is not like the categories are not there, because when you receive something, you receive the whole mood. And if the French Revolution is there, then the nature is kind of changed with the political questioning of the day, and what you receive and how you perceive nature is also in line.
Part of the question here is it possible to have a sort of political geography of nature? The Rhine is free-born because its source is in Switzerland, where Rousseau is from. It's also Rousseau's source. And it's also a place which has become a republic, and the water flows down through German lands. So you can have something which is natural, which is geographical, which is a topos, but which is also implicitly or possibly politicized, right? Which becomes historical in the way that, of course, geography is always historical. And here made metaphysical through the pathos of the tragic. Nikos, let's go to Nikos, and then let's take a break, and we'll come back and have more discussion. Nikos, go ahead.
Hi. I don't have so much of a question, but if I would be allowed to indulge in some
Please.
Associative thinking, I guess, is that when I was kind of reading the poem, but also especially now that we're talking about it, and within the context of this tragic element of gods, of the abandonment of gods, of humans, a figure has kind of I remembered the figure of Benhoeffer, Dietrich Benhoeffer, and I'm kind of going to focus on this relation between gods and mortals that we discussed, and this kind of idea that gods need humans to feel on behalf of them. And for me, this kind of implies a certain weakness, which is a kind of contradiction to this omnipotence that usually is accorded to gods. So anyways, I tried to kind of locate the kind of, because I remember somehow that Ben Heffer talks about God as a weak figure. And this is also a political kind of incitement. So anyways, I can read the quote for you. It's from a letter. God is weak and powerless in the world, and that is exactly the only way in which he can be with us and help us.
This is holding.
This is Ben Heffer.
Okay. So, yeah.
So it's coincidentally also, it's actually fine, I should mention this for people that maybe are not familiar with Ben Heffer. He wrote that letter a couple days prior to his attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler. So there's also a particular also coincidence with the attempt of Sinclair to murder the elector. But the idea that I would like to explore, maybe kind of put forward to discuss, is this idea of the god's weakness as a sort of giving of agency, but also as a giving of responsibility to mortals to feel in this case, but also to act on that feeling. So, and maybe to also restore some sort of lost bond, I guess. I don't know if that's actually possible, but yeah, I thought of placing that as a kind of marker of thought for the poem.
Yeah, those are very interesting comments. I agree. I mean, it is a fascinating passage, right? Which seems to bear upon, on the one hand, the whole sort of, how to put it, like the whole essence, really, of polytheism and of the Christian Trinity, right? The gods are fully sufficient to themselves. Their immortality is enough for them. They feel nothing. And if, right? So this is a nice grammar of the poem, the conditional grammar, right? And if they need something, if they have a need, it's of heroes and mortals and men and human beings. Because then, since they feel nothing. So precisely because they suffice to themselves, they need something other than themselves. This is the structure of the exception and of the exteriority of the sufficiency of the gods to itself, as it were. That is, the very sufficiency opens upon exteriority precisely because it is sufficient. It needs something which does not suffice to itself. That's the relation to, let's say, the other in this poem, ein anderer, right? And it's a meticulously sort of schematic passage because there's a whole philosophy implied by it. And to think of it in terms of the weakness of the gods is interesting for sure. I mean, you can already see that in the figure of the Trinity, right? Why can't God simply be self-identical, right? In a Spinoza scenario where God and nature are substance, then we have the proliferation of the attributes and all the modes, all the finite modes, but all of them simply are substance. One might also conceive of that as substance feeling itself through the finite modes. That would be, as Deleuze says, to make substance turn around the modes at the end of difference and repetition. But here, the gods are, one might say, implicitly plural, or we have something like the Trinity as well, because there has to be a sort of concretization or a mediation with mortality in both polytheism and in Christianity. And I say in Holderlin, you can particularly find this in the poem Homecoming, or several other poems, how there's an elemental poetics. The gods in a polytheistic scenario are immanent to the elements, and it's the elements that the humans feel. And that's the gods feeling themselves through the humans, since in and of themselves, without this other, they feel nothing. So whether that's weakness, etc., here it's not really specifically said to be weakness, right? They need and they use us, but they also, right, prevail over us with a brutal law, right? Their Gericht, right? Which is that if you don't respect the inequality of gods and mortals, you will be destroyed and annihilated, right? You will become the tragic sign, which is zero. So here, the power of the gods over mortals is in their prohibition of going beyond inequality. You can feel in our name on behalf of us. We can share out the feeling that we don't have to you and feel through you, but you cannot thereby think that you are equal to us or you will be destroyed. This is the system of the tragic. So the mediation between the gods has to still involve non-identity. That's its whole ground. So I yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting reference and framework for thinking about this, and it's a very powerful strophe in Hölderlin. The other thing that I just want to say briefly before we take a break is that this theme of the withdrawal of the gods, I would also say this is complicated across Hölderlin's oeuvre. So in Bread and Wine, we see the gods have withdrawn. And in other poems, the gods have withdrawn. But he'll say in some other poems, kind of like this one, in Bread and Wine, it's like the gods are still here, but they're away up above. They're no longer, they're separated from us. But sometimes in other poems, it's not so, they are here, and these utopian passages in this poem, the gods and mortals celebrate their nuptials. And there's a temporary suspension of fate. And the master craftsman, comes down to earth, inclines to the present earth. And the burden of joy relates us to the gods. We suffer it and endure it. And the master craftsman here finds more good than evil. So there are different versions or attitudes towards this relation to the gods and modernity in Hölderlin's poems. And it's good just to keep in mind to deal with that, to try to deal with it flexibly in the context of different poems, and then to draw them into relation with one another. Let's take a 5-minute break and then come back for discussion. So if there are other passages people want to take a look at, other issues people want to raise, let's come back, and we can also take a look at some of these things which have been written up so 5 minutes. So the first passage from Heidegger that Alex has posted is, how can a poem, I speak only of Hölderlin's poems, still become a different power today when altogether different realities determine our Dasein, let's say our mode of existence? A poem, something flimsy without resistance, evanescent, abstruse, and without substance, such a thing belongs nowhere anymore. And then a second passage. For lyric on handmade Japanese paper bound in leather with gold trim can indeed be charming and pleasing, but this is not the space in which poetry belongs. Yet perhaps it is not at all the fault of the poem that we no longer experience any power in it, but has something to do with with the fact that we have forfeited our ability to experience, and with the fact that our Dasein is entangled in an everydayness that keeps expelled from every domain in which art unfolds its power. So this is the sort of rhetorical questions from Heidegger to his audience note in the middle of the 1930s about, what, it's the same question Hölderlin asks actually in Bread and Wine, right? What is Wozu Dichter? What's the poet for in a destitute time? We could open this up to other people want to respond to these passages from Heidegger's seminar or have thoughts on them? Okay, I can say a little bit about them. I mean, so first of all, we have here the question of the relation between the 20th century, let's say something like 130 years after Hölderlin is writing, and the moment of the early 19th century, Hölderlin's moment. So Hölderlin is relating modernity to antiquity quite often, posing the problem of the sort of destiny of modernity, we might say. But here it's the relationship of a different historical epoch in which Heidegger says that our altogether different realities determine our Dasein. So here we can see Heidegger's sort of despairing orientation toward what has become of modernity, which, is compromised by what I regard as a pretty poor understanding of modernity, which allows Heidegger to think, for example, well, there's no difference between like Bolshevism and Americanism. It's all like big business and production and industry, etc. So there's kind of reactionary relationship to the politics of modernity, and that he's posing this question implicitly. Heidegger certainly does, and you can see it in his introductory remarks to the seminars, mobilize and appropriate Hölderlin, for the formation of National Socialist subjects. And I think that's very much a valid critique of Heidegger, even though I find tremendous value in these seminars as well. And so the question is, what is poetry for in the 20th century? I mean, you're saying the poems you find it difficult to fully engage with them because they feel either naive or sentimental, but I understand that. Actually, I've certainly had similar feelings when I started to read Hölderlin myself, because Hölderlin is, to some extent, he's a curious figure. He's an ambiguous figure because he is very naive. And at the same time, he's one of the most philosophically precise and rigorous, poetic thinkers who's ever written. And his politics are very interesting at the same time as he can often seem disoriented or sort of, we'll come back to this when we're talking about Andenken. But yeah, Jack, do you want to jump in?
Yes. I apologize for my setting. I had to leave the library. It's closed now. But I hope my audio is okay.
Yeah.
There was one thing I think Heidegger raised that I found interesting, and it's sort of also part of what I brought up last week when we were talking about Brodenwein. I said I found the poem like slightly more haunting or like dark, like this image of the night. I found particularly unnerving or something. Whereas I thought you sort of felt like it sort of portrayed more of the hope or like the chaos and yet potential of this moment Hölderlin was living in. And then similarly, so I think people were asking questions about really the relevance of the French Revolution and how important that is to this poem we're reading this week. And I think my feelings about it would be something like, inevitably for Hölderlin, the French Revolution is like a huge political event, and there's no doubt that like the Rhine is like greatly influenced by that moment. But perhaps what I liked about Heidegger, at least from the parts that I read, that he kind of admits that, well, we've been living for 130, 40, 50 years since then, and the history of the French Revolution is much different for us through our eyes than it was for Hölderlin, and we can't we have things to add to the story. And there was this section, if I could read it, from page 27 to 28, where when Heidegger's talking about Spengler, amongst others, and their picture of poetry as the expression of lived experience. And he says about them that this way of thinking is not the result of an accidental shallowness or inability to think on the part of certain individuals, but it has its essential grounds in the kind of being belonging to the human being in the 19th century and of modernity in general. Which I thought, although now I'm reading it again, was about a bit more about the 20th century, or generally what's happened since the French Revolution. And that was just something I quite liked, the idea that if Hölderlin's he has a lot of speculative philosophy and thought within his poetry, these riddles that are not resolved as such, but which are simply laid out for us, that those riddles change through time, and the riddle of the French Revolution for Hölderlin is different from the riddle of the French Revolution for us. But that's just sort of an idea, and I wanted to float that out there.
Yes, I think that's extremely important. And I think that Heidegger, I mean, okay, I think the key way of thinking this through in terms of, let's say, the pathos of modernity is that if the French Revolution poses the problem of freedom, and the workers' movement then poses the problem of the relation between freedom and equality in a new way via Marx, Heidegger is going to find all of that fatally compromised by sort of productivist Bolshevism. And again, Bolshevism to him is the same thing as capitalism. That, let's say broadly, industrial modernity is catastrophe for Heidegger. Let's also say that we can admit that, you know, that's not false. You know, as we see, there's a lot in that which is correct. So understanding the sort of movement from the Industrial Revolution into the 20th century as catastrophic is something now that we're all extremely familiar with. The question is how we orient ourselves to, let's say, the meaning of the French Revolution and the relationship of poetry to it. So the relation of poesis and the problem of freedom as it's mediated by history. One thing which I think is maybe a moment for some broader remarks on the significance of Heidegger and the reception of Hölderlin, you know, now for, let's say, 50 years, Hölderlin criticism has been dominated then by critiques of Heidegger or attempts to overcome and move beyond, you know, Heidegger, the influence, the constitutive influence of Heidegger's reading of Hölderlin on his reception, which primarily have to do, let's say, with the linking of certain ontological questions to a kind of nationalist politics, which of course is certainly there. One thing that I think is absolutely crucial, though, you know, I disagree. Actually, Paul de Man is a good example of a sort of symptomatic case in this respect. So Paul de Man, in his early sort of review essay on Heidegger's elucidations of Hölderlin, he's sort of ridiculing Heidegger for imposing his own philosophy on Hölderlin and turning everything in Hölderlin to, you know, into something about being, and how Heidegger is the only one supposedly who has access to this mystery of being, etc. Part of the problem is de Man in those essays is talking about Heidegger like he's a conventional substance ontologist, you know, as if he thinks that like being is like the one all, rather than that being is the exteriority of time, you know, to which we have access because of the exteriority of temporalization, which affects our modality of being, since we're thrown into the world and since we project ahead of ourselves and are riven by the form of time. So that critique completely misunderstands Heidegger's own ontology and then sort of complains about its application to Hölderlin. But what I think Heidegger is right about is that the questions that he's foregrounding in Hölderlin are really there. So for example, if we look at Wie wenn am Feiertage, you know, if we look at this, these astonishing formulations in this poem, right? If we begin with this famous strophe, after the evocation of this morning on which the countryman goes out and looks at the fields, right? But now day breaks. I waited and saw it come, and what I saw, the hallowed, my word shall convey. I would prefer to translate that as something like, and what I saw, the holy be my word, is actually like what it says. For she herself, who was older than the ages and higher than the gods of Orient and Occident, nature, right? Die Natur, has now awoken amid the clang of arms. And from high aether down to lowest abyss, according to fixed law, vestem Gesetze, begotten, as in the past, on holy chaos, delight, the all-creative, delights in self-renewal. I might prefer to translate that, let me just check my translation, as begotten of holy chaos, inspiration, Begeisterung, the all-creating, the Allerschaffende, again feels itself anew. So here, with the daybreak, nature awakes, who is older than the age, older than time, right? Higher than the gods of Orient and Occident. So phusis, in the Greek sense, revives with this looking out onto the fields in the morning. And I waited and saw it come, and what I saw, the holy be my word. So language becomes invested with this naming of die Natur and this evocation of its identity, the identity of phusis and poiesis, of nature with the all-creating, with inspiration, enthusiasm, Begeisterung. This is a key evocation of also of pathos, the self-feeling, feeling itself anew. So this is an ontological passage, you know. This is a passage of the highest ontological importance in the history of poetry. Nature and phusis are identified through inspiration and creation, and these are named with the holy word. Okay, so Heidegger is not just making up. He's not just foisting onto Hölderlin the question of being. It's there in a passage like this. And it's very different also than in Heidegger himself. But Hölderlin will influence Heidegger so much that he begins to think in something like this way, I would say. So I think that my point is that Heidegger gives us certain key, you know, he's willing to take on the sort of ontological significance of Hölderlin's poetics in a way which is extremely important, you know, the essence of poiesis, and in a way which many other commentators, and sort of reacting against Heidegger, have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. You know, they've tried to jettison this ontological interpretation of Hölderlin, which in my opinion is just crucial to understanding what's in the poems, a passage like this. So what I think is necessary, right, is to sever, to unbind the ontological interpretation of Hölderlin, which Heidegger gives us, from his nationalist politics, from his Nazi politics, indeed, in this period, but not to jettison that, you know, that element of the thinking of the being of beings, which is also in, and here it is thought as something like an event, as a taking place. Which is then related to the problem of the tragic in this poem. So yes, I think, and so the problem, I think, bears on the relationship of the French Revolution to Nazism. You know, so Heidegger is appropriating Hölderlin to read his oeuvre against its own politics, right? To now turn the revolutionary problem into the politics of National Socialism. What can Hölderlin do for us? Right? We have Heidegger saying things. Hölderlin is not a pacifist. Hölderlin is about, like, you know, suffering and determination, etc. Again, something which is not necessarily untrue, but which is linked to an untrue politics. So I think the problem then of the historical movement of the pathos of modernity is to see how Hölderlin's thinking of Germany is a thinking in relation to France, which is on the side of the French Revolution. And now that will be what Heidegger rejects and attempts to fully nationalize. And this is what Adorno identifies as the problem of the foreign in Holderlin, which is mishandled, repressed, overlooked by Heidegger. So yes, it is a key sort of relay from the 19th century to the 20th. Aaron, you have a question?
Question.
Or
I
a
do.
comment. Yeah.
I do both. Let's note both, right? Because this was so productive and interesting, and I do really want to get at this idea of the absolute, right? I was especially really struck, I think, what you were saying earlier, citing his works about his definition of tragedy, if you could reiterate that, because I'm losing it a bit. But let me just note these two things first. Like, one is a translation issue, um, that I had early on in the Rhine, actually about Erlösung, about the voice of the boy, the demigod, who is the voice of the Rhine. It's Erlösung jammern,
Yes.
right? And it's like he has it as like release. But like I would think of that. I mean, like there's the obvious religious significance of Erlösung as salvation, right? Um, and Yammern, I think of more as like, I don't know, like complaining, but
Yeah.
like lament would be my poetic rendering of it, right? Like, and it's an odd formulation that seems to just sort of disappear in the translation, where he's like lamenting salvation, right? Like, there seems something like actually like related to this idea of fate or destiny that he's rejecting, he's lamenting in some ways, even like Judeo-Christian messianism, that he's like, and there does seem to me at least this revolutionary interpretation of, right, I guess what Heidegger might say is like the hubris of Hegel, right? This idea that we could think the absolute, um, and sort of like understanding this sort of ambition after Kant to try to think the absolute again as one and the same with the ambition of the French Revolution to defy fate and take our fate into our own hands. Um, so there's some interesting overlaps there, I guess. And I was curious about the way you had formulated earlier, talking about like the destiny or the fate of freedom seems to me actually like a contradiction in terms, right? And it does seem like he is lamenting what has become of this effort to seize freedom, that there was a destiny there, a tragedy there. Um, I don't know, those tensions are what's productive.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots to say on them.
Yeah, that's really great. I would translate that passage you refer to in strophe 2 as wait a second here.
Yeah, here it's implore release. And at least the theological significance gets lost.
So I would translate it as there in coldest abyss, I heard the young one wail for deliverance.
Okay. But not against, but for.
So these are my colleague Stephen Ross and I are translating Holderlin, and these are our translations that I'm referring to, which I'm not sharing yet. But so I agree. Wail. Some people have. I think Seabirth has. I think wine for Yammern, and for deliverance. I think would be a nice. That sort of sustains part of that theological element that you have in mind, and also the relation to his parentage, right? That this is essentially like a young child, right, who wants to be released by his parents. He wants to rage through the world. The problem of the absolute. Let's see if I can bring up this. So I think the key thing here is to relate the absolute to poetry, to think of art in both Schelling and Holderlin as the organon of the absolute. Why? Because art is poiesis. Art conjoins the subject and the object through the making of an object by the subject. And that object is made in such a way that it's not an entirely intentional production. It's also a confluence of conscious and unconscious activity. That is to say, the agency of nature within the subject, which is for Kant what genius is, which results in the production of an object, which produces aesthetic experience in the beholder, right? So we have a transmission from the activity of nature, the all creative power of die Natur, through the subject as the one who is capable of bringing together conscious and unconscious activity, in the production of an object which bears within it the trace, right, of that creativity, that confluence of conscious and unconscious activity, which then we can feel when we encounter that object. So for them also, this is, and tragedy is crucial here, because as you say, it is a contradiction in terms, this relationship between necessity and freedom, which is Schelling's theory of the tragic, right? The tragic is the identity of freedom and necessity. And we know it's a contradiction because it results in destruction, right? So just like in Hegel, when there's a contradiction, it produces a negation. It produces a movement of the dialectic. Now, in tragedy, that negation is annihilation, the reduction to zero, right, of the being, of the representative being. The being who pushes freedom to the point of its identity with necessity. This is Schelling's theory of tragedy. Oedipus would be the key figure, right? Precisely in attempting to avoid his fate, he brings it about such that fate is such that freedom becomes one with fate. They're indiscernible and in contradiction, and that indiscernible contradiction destroys the subject. And that destruction is the exposure of the absolute. And the tragic artwork, right? What's important about tragedy having to be an artwork, the absolute having to be expressed through the artwork, is that it can't be conceptualized. It can't be brought under the concept because it can only be felt, because it involves annihilation. So the annihilation can be suffered. We can undergo a catharsis. And so beyond the kind of civic therapy or emotional therapy that's involved in catharsis, we can also think about catharsis as the feeling of the absolute, right? Which can only be felt. So it can only be conveyed by the work of art. Holderlin, here's the passage you were asking about in Holderlin on, where is it? The significance of tragedies. The significance of tragedies can be understood most easily by way of paradox. Since all potential is divided justly and equally, all original matter, I would say originary, appears not in its originary strength, in fact, but in fact in its weakness, such that quite properly the light of life and the appearance attach to the weakness of every whole. So it appears as weakness because it's divided justly and equally. Now, in the tragic, the sign in itself is insignificant, without effect, yet the originary is straightforward. One might say is forthright. Properly speaking, the originary can only appear in its weakness. So let's say normally, the originary can only appear in its weakness as divided, right? However, to the extent that the sign is posited as insignificant, equals zero, the originary, the hidden foundation of any nature, can also present itself. If nature properly presents itself in its weakest talent, weakest manifestation, then the sign is nature presenting itself in its most powerful talent equals zero. So that is to say, when the originary appears, it appears as zero, right? Because otherwise it is distributed equally among all the beings, particular by particular. The whole can only appear through the annihilation of the particular. And that particular has to be pushed to the point of a sort of intersection of freedom and necessity. So this is, yes, this zero is the manifestation of the absolute through the annihilation of the representative particular. Arnab, yes?
Professor, I was thinking this the the representation through zero of by the absolute as the return of the originary, isn't it also a reference to a incarnational soteriology, in incarnation soteriology, insofar zero is associated with the messianic in certain ancient numerological systems, that zero stands for the reincarnation of the absolute in as a sort of soteriological mode of being, if I may say that.
Yeah, I think I understand your point. I would say, so first of all, one thing I would say is I don't know what Holderlin's relation to that sort of numerological material would have been. But I think it's true that there is a messianic element of the presentation of the absolute in Holderlin, which is the advent within historical time of the absolute. And that is problematized by, for example, the French Revolution. That is to say, the relationship between destiny and freedom is pushed to a point of maximal contradiction. I think that's part of what we see dramatized in this poem. That's my reading of the allegorical dimension of this poem. But I would also say that in the passage on the significance of tragedies that we just looked at, it's also very important that tragedy, as it were, is just a form of representation. It's just a modality of artistic presentation. That is to say, it's a representation of series of actions, etc. It's a drama, So it's capable of producing the absolute, but the absolute there doesn't have to be the coming of Christ, right? It can be a production of Antigone, a production of the Agamemnon, a production of the death of Empedocles. So tragedy as an artwork, as a form of presentation through the artwork can give us a presentation of the absolute without having to involve the second coming of Christ. But it's not, but you are correct. I think it's very important that in Bread and Wine, there certainly is a messianic dimension of Holderlin's historical thinking. And it's related to precisely the problem of the becoming corporeal or the becoming material or the becoming historical of the absolute. Carlos, yep.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to tap, in the same lines or just more with this kind of Antigone, on the play, the epic theater from Bertolt Brecht in 1948, I think, which is also a adaptation or translation of this Holdernins. And if you had anything to say when it comes to this transposition on when Brecht was basically deploying this piece, was obviously transposing what Holdernit, this more Hegelian position on Antigone, or just what you were referring as this Greek term of ate. And just just kind of I've kind of just been within this seminar thinking a lot about the sublime, as it's also been mentioned, or the absolute, I mean, I'm now deviating, but just first maybe within this question, like just like if you have anything to say from and like Brecht Antigone perspective on.
Well, I mean, you know that Straub and Huillet. Do you know the Straub and Huillet film? Have you?
No, I
Okay,
don't.
okay. So I can actually put a link to it maybe
Mhm.
in the because okay, so the filmmakers Straub and Huillet made a film version of Antigone, which is Holderlin's translation of
This
Antigone.
is from 1990s, right? I would like
Yeah,
is I think probably yeah.
with Holderlin's translation of
Mhm.
Antigone as staged by Brecht, and they make a film of that, and it's an astonishing film. And then you know that they also Straub and Huillet also made a film version of the first version of The Death of Empedocles, which is also just incredible. So if you would like, I can put links to both of those two films on the
Yeah, that would be great.
um India says, is tragedy the imperative of suffering for freedom? Um, I think so. Again, in Schelling, tragedy is not just suffering from freedom because the problem is one can't just choose freedom. To choose to suffer for freedom would just be to be free. Right? So that kind of martyrdom is actually in Schelling's theory, and I think I would agree with him in my reading of the Greek plays, antithetical to the nature of tragedy. If you can simply choose to die for freedom, that's not a tragedy. Even Antigone, right? One has to think about the sort of weird unconscious determinations of the history in which Antigone finds herself, which is very interesting because you have this differential between her and Ismene. They're both sisters from the same family in the same circumstances. They react completely differently to the scenario at the beginning of the play, but still, the tragic in Schelling's theory has to involve, and Goethe says the same thing. There has to be something irreconcilable in the tragic, and it's precisely the irreconcilable identity of freedom and necessity. They have to be one and the same, and therefore neither freedom nor necessity. But then the contradiction, the problem is that one sort of it would be unbearable, except as Schelling also puts it, freedom tries to conquer necessity on its own ground, by affirming it. So that is to say, after Oedipus finds out what has happened, he puts out his eyes. And this is perhaps not fated. So that very acceptance, taking responsibility for the intersection of freedom and that itself, you're taking responsibility for what you are not responsible for. So this, I suppose, is a dimension of freedom. Freedom, as it were, conquers necessity on its own ground by taking responsibility for the fact that one is not free. And this is the highest contradiction in the tragic for Schelling. And it's only through that kind of absolute contradiction that the absolute can be experienced, can be presented, can be felt, etc., can be undergone. So there is something to your comment, yes, but it can't just be a sacrifice. There has to be a contradiction within the sacrifice. Any last comment? Where I guess okay. So once again, we're not going to be able to do introductions. We're going to have to put them in the middle of the session next time so that we can, because I do want to hear them. But it's also, this is a nice way to do introductions. It's perhaps better to keep hearing what people have to say and ask about. But any final remarks for this session? Yes, Aaron.
Actually, a question this time then, because also your little mention of the therapeutic
Yeah.
got me thinking to Freud and to skip. I guess I'm a practicing analyst.
Ah,
That's my introduction. But I guess I am thinking, like, if you're thinking differently in talking about the unconscious and this Schellingian formulation of tragedy from a Freudian one and Freud's own sort of constitutively it always seemed to me that Freud's move of sort of naming his sort of like crux of human nature after tragedy is to put the absolute out of bounds in some way, to say that we can never fully know our motivations. We can never sort of close the circuit of being and knowing. And I was just sort of curious if you're thinking how what you were talking about from the Schellingian or more idealist perspective fits or doesn't fit with a Freudian one.
yeah. I mean, um, I think it fits, but I think the two analyses are operating on different levels, right? So Freud wants to, he finds in Oedipus the, the presentation of a complex, which is a form of inextricable experience that one has to undergo, that one has to suffer, which can take all kinds of different forms, but which has a structure, you know. But Freud, I would say, isn't really giving us a theory of the tragic work of art. Freud is giving us a theory of the unconscious that we can glean from a particular tragedy, maybe from other tragedies as well. Schelling is giving us a philosophy, a concept of the tragic, you know, um, that is a metaphysical theory. That is to say, it bears upon the relation between freedom and necessity. And and so I think that that can be held in common with Freud's approach to what we can learn about the structure of the unconscious and its relationship to our experience of our, attachments and our sexuality. Um, but and then I think that would also bear upon, this idea that the art object is the confluence of conscious and unconscious experience. I think that there Schelling is making a point where it's very important to hold in mind Freud as like contributing to the way that we think about that. Because, okay, so when someone like Lukács, he sort of polemicizes against German Romanticism for attaching it to itself to a cult of the night, which he views as proto-fascist, which he views as an anti-Enlightenment position. But I would say, on the contrary, it's very important to think about this figure of the night in German Romanticism as involving this dimension of the unconscious, which, in fact, we have to reckon with. We cannot and ought not disavow, right? So Hegel's own critique of Enlightenment, which is that Enlightenment is unfair to religion because it asks it to enter into this ground which is not its own. Hegel practically writes, Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment in advance in 1807. It's basically the same argument. This denial of the limitations of reason. And in the figure of the night, we get not just a sort of like hatred of reason or a rejection of enlightenment or reason, but a grappling with that which is unconscious and its import to creative productivity. So there, I think Freud, is the friend of a thinking of the production of the artwork as involving these unconscious dimensions, which contribute to its complexity. That is to say, the irreducibility of the artwork to just one reading or to statements or propositions, its internal contradictions and non-identity with itself. Okay, we have to go. Next week.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody for your questions. Thanks for your discussion posts that are up. Please feel free to contribute more discussion posts after this session. Next time we'll be talking about Patmos primarily, so I look forward to it. Thanks for the great your great contributions to the session. See you soon.
Thank you. Have a nice week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.